Thank you so much for joining us in our new programming space. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I'm the Public Programs Manager here at the New Orleans Museum of Art. I'm extremely excited to welcome you, one, for our exhibitions in Minty Acadia, which is right behind us, the beautiful evergreen walls. That exhibition is only on view for another week, so please come back and visit. The last day is January 26th. This evening we're going to have a really incredible program featuring Nathaniel Rich, who's the author of Losing Earth, and also featuring Mr. Mark Davis, who's a premier scholar of climate change in this area. So thank you so much. They're going to have a seat here. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then there's an incredible book signing of Losing Earth where Nathaniel Rich will be in the museum shop. So please join us for that. Sure. Thank you.
It is a pleasure to see you all here tonight. I mean, I keep wondering if like Sonny Landreth or someone's coming in. This is a really important conversation for us to have, I think. And I mean, New Orleans is often talked about as being kind of the epicenter of a lot of climate policy, climate impacts, and this, that, and the other. But there's a lot of talk, often not a lot of action. So actually what got me interested when they called and said, would you have a conversation with Daniel? I said, well, of course I will. But I would always wonder what gets people into this. I mean, I just fell in with the wrong crowd. I can't explain to you that. But what prompted you to write Losing Earth?
Yeah, so I guess I should explain, by way of introduction, I'm a novelist, and I do long-form reporting essays. I'm a writer at large at the New York Times Magazine, and the piece really came out of frustration, not so much out of an activist impulse to do something about climate change, although it's a subject that I've thought about and been obsessed with for many years. But it came more out of a frustration that the way that it was being written about, or not written about. I felt like there was a lot of good journalism about the subject. Very intrepid reporting had been done. I felt that we knew the political story pretty well, the story of industry's involvement in the last several decades to thwart any meaningful climate policy. I felt there had been good reporting about the science of it, where things were headed. What to expect. What I felt was missing was a serious grappling with the way that this crisis is touching our lives now. And I don't just mean in terms of wildfires and floods. I mean in terms of how we think about our futures, how we make sense of the reality we're in. I think the questions extend to how do we make sense of the democracy we live in if it's been unable to grapple with this existential threat. And how does the knowledge of all of this, all of these horrors coming for us, how does that filter into our own emotional, personal, psychological lives? And I felt that by writing a narrative about this subject, and as far as I could figure out, no one had ever written a dramatic narrative about climate change, at least if you don't count sort of first-person journalistic going to Greenland accounts. And so I chose this period between 1979 and 1989 to write about a couple of figures in particular who were the first people not only to grapple with the science and the policy and the politics of the matter, but also were the first people to grapple with what it meant in their own lives and for their own families. And so I felt by telling the intimate story of those people in those years that I would be able to get at some of these larger questions.
Well, that's an interesting point because I've got probably most of those really good but wonky books, and I find that most people don't read them. I mean, I teach at Tulane Law School, for those of you who don't know, and I teach about water law. And every year I ask my students, if they've ever heard of the Dust Bowl. Because water law is not just about how much water, it's about what happens when you have too little. That's when people really value it. And they all put their hands up. And I said, well, how did you learn about the Dust Bowl? I mean, heaven knows there have been any number of, papers and reports, conferences, and every year it's John Steinbeck and Woody Guthrie. And it does strike me that, having all of the analysis and data is hugely important, but without a narrative, it doesn't go far. I mean, I've never seen, a scientific paper or even a law, a legal argument that was its own best champion when it comes to informing people. And that's what intrigued me, really one of the first times I talked to Nathaniel, other than why did you write this book, it was, how did you get to know Rafe Pomeranz? And if you haven't read the book, you should, and you'll meet Rafe Pomeranz.
Maybe I should just read it first.
Yeah, that'd be terrific. You can do that.
So I'll just read the very first page, which is the introduction to Rafe, who's really the main character, one of two main characters, along with James Hansen, Vanessa, scientist. The first suggestion to Rafe Pomeranz that humankind was destroying the conditions necessary for its own survival came on page 66 of the government publication EPA 600, 778, 19. It was a technical report bound in a coal-black cover with beige lettering about coal, one of many such reports that lay in uneven piles around Pomeranz's windowless office on the first floor of the Capitol Hill townhouse that served as the Washington headquarters of Friends of the Earth. In the final paragraph of the chapter on environmental regulation, the coal report's authors noted that the continued use of fossil fuels might, within 2 or 3 decades, bring about significant and damaging changes to the global atmosphere. I should say this is the spring of 1979, this scene. Pomeranz, startled, paused over the orphan paragraph. It seemed to have come out of nowhere. He reread it. It made no sense. Pomeranz was not a scientist. 11 years earlier, he graduated from Cornell with a degree in history. He had the tweedy appearance of an undernourished doctoral student emerging at dawn from the stacks with horn-rimmed glasses and a thickish mustache that wilted disapprovingly over the corners of his mouth. His defining characteristic was his gratuitous height, 6 feet 4 inches, which seemed to embarrass him. He stooped over to accommodate his interlocutors. His active face was prone to breaking out in wide, even maniacal grins, but in composure, as when he read the coal report, it projected concern. He struggled with technical reports. He proceeded as a historian would, cautiously, scrutinizing the source material, reading between the lines. When that failed, he made phone calls, often to the authors of the reports, who tended to be surprised to hear from him. Scientists were not used to fielding questions from political lobbyists. They were not used to thinking about politics. Pomeranz had one big question about the coal report. If the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas could invite global catastrophe, why had nobody told him about it? I'll stop there. And he was, during the 70s, which was essentially during his 20s, dedicated himself to clean air, working at Friends of the Earth, environmental nonprofit founded by David Brower, Sierra Club, and he was really heavily involved in amendments to the Clean Air Act that passed at the end of the 70s. So he was really an expert on the nuances of environmental law, very complicated environmental law. I'd written much of the law himself, and yet he'd never heard of this climate change business. And at first he assumed it wasn't, he misunderstood something, but of course as he read more and more, he came to understand that by that time, spring of 1979, there was scientific consensus about the fundamental science of climate change. And I should say that consensus hasn't shifted since then. We have more detail, we have more data, our predictions are more precise, but the fundamental picture hasn't changed since then. That was one reason I wanted to start in that period. And the story is how he and others within and outside of the government, including at very high levels, his partner on all of this was a guy named Gordon MacDonald, who was probably one of the most senior people in the intelligence community, how they pushed for 10 years to try to bring about policy that would fix the problem. And the stories about, there's a series of letdowns and retreats, but by the end of the decade, they get to the precipice of what's seen at the time to be a global solution, which is a treaty to reduce carbon emissions. It's the first version of what is still the IPCC process now as we know it. And at the last second, it all comes apart. Talk about why later.
As many of my plans have. Again, you'll get to meet Rafe if you read the book. I mean, I've known Rafe for a number of years, and it's a very apt description.
How did you first meet him? Do you remember?
As I say, I run with bad company, troublesome people. Well, and in my own introduction to some of these things, like our disappearing coast, came much the same way. When I moved to Louisiana in 1991, I was just coming down to be a lawyer, and I can't even remember how it first came across my desk that the coast was disappearing and all these horrible things might happen. There are all sorts of science reports, and you can go back into the 1890s.
Can you project a little more?
Sure. You can go back into the 1890s and find the science is there. The science is clear, but the science wasn't speaking to the people to listen. And my reaction, like Rafe's, was, well, if this is true, somebody be doing something about it. And it would be top people. So I really don't need to do anything because who am I? He's a historian. And then you find out that the bigger the issue, the less likely it is it's anybody's job. And as a citizen, in his case, as an activist, it became his job. And that's actually how coastal restoration became a thing in Louisiana. It was a civic thing before it was a political thing or a governmental thing. And so Rafe and I, I've always had that kind of curious parallel.
It's amazing. I had not thought about parallel between the work being done here on coastal restoration and climate change in that way, the political process. It's something that drew me to Rafe's story immediately, and also to some extent James Hansen, who by the end of the decade would be the face of climate science, around the same time becomes interested in the story. And I was drawn to them on a personal level because of exactly what you described. They respond, I think, in the way that all of us might respond, or I imagine myself responding, coming across this kind of apocalyptic news, which is to say, well, surely, I must be not understanding it, or if I am, surely somebody is on this. And it's incredibly destabilizing and unsettling for him when he realizes that nobody is, or that the few people that are haven't gotten anywhere with it. And so he takes it upon himself. The first phase of the book, first section, is he takes it upon himself to hold meetings at the highest levels of the U.S. government, the Carter administration. People are generally sympathetic to what he's talking about. To try to, essentially he gives lectures on climate change. This is what climate change is, this is what's going to happen, we need to act. And he thinks, well, surely once they understand it, out of some sense of prudence or common sense, they'll begin taking measures. And he realizes they won't, and that's his first kind of awakening, and he realizes that more is going to be required.
Well, because in your book you describe, the situation was different then. I mean, there were a lot of people who hadn't heard, and overcoming ignorance is a different thing, than overcoming, entrenched political opposition. At the time, it was not a polarized political issue the way it has become. That's almost impossible, I think, for people who come to the issue in the last, even 10 years, to appreciate. Explain how that, what that world was like and how we moved from there to kind of the position where we kind of lost that window.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, and you're right, it was one of the hardest things in the writing of the piece to communicate, because to imagine a political landscape that's so different from what we know of today, it's almost like going into an alternate universe. And so what does that mean? Well, certainly there was, differences between the parties on environmental regulation and conservation and all that. But it was Nixon who passed these major environmental laws. There were a group of Republicans who considered themselves environmentalists. And in fact, much of the major environmental progress that was made during the decade, a lot of it grinded to a halt under Reagan, but there was a strong and vocal group of Republicans who were very worried about global warming, who introduced major bills in Congress. In fact, by the end of the decade, at the sort of the high point, in 1988 and 1989, as the issue becomes a national issue, you have a couple of omnibus pieces of legislation, bipartisan, one from a Republican, one from a Democrat, that are more ambitious in many of their aspects than what is now known as the Green New Deal. And it wasn't seen as a partisan issue at the time, and of course that begins to change very suddenly, 1988, 89. But that's another fascinating thing about this era, is it's a new issue, it's a new in terms of the politics of it, and the fault lines haven't developed yet. And so there's a sense of enormous possibility. And it's almost like a Twilight Zone, reading some quotes from politicians, Republican politicians in particular, during that period, about how urgently the U.S. needs to not only act on climate change, but needs to lead a global response in order to solve the problem.
I think that's worth thinking about for a minute. Again, drawing a parallel to coastal Louisiana. And anyone thinks that coastal Louisiana's fate and future are not tied to climate needs to think a little bit more about it. But we wouldn't have a coastal restoration program that had passed through Congress if it had not been for Republican Senator John Chafee from Rhode Island. He was our third senator, and often our most effective. He was chairing the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. That kind of bipartisanship and taking science at face value was commonplace at that point. There's been a concerted effort made to change that version of governance, and the only thing that I can see, and I think Rafe is much the same, is that when government doesn't work for you, it's the citizens' job to remind them that in fact they need to get back to the business of taking care of difficult but important business.
Yeah, there's a remarkable speech I came across that was delivered by Malcolm Forbes Baldwin, I think, Malcolm Baldwin Forbes, in 1980. And he was a Republican who was in charge of the environmental office within the White House. And Reagan, during the lead up to the inauguration, had talked about possibly closing the office. Certainly hostile to environmental regulations and all the rest. And this administrator gives this very impassioned speech to a group of businessmen. It's a business convention. I quote from it in the book. But essentially it's a conservative argument for stewardship of the environment. And he says, of course, there's nothing more conservative ideologically than protecting what we have and making sure that we don't take wild risks with the resources that we rely upon, and all the rest. And it's that line of thought does persist through the decade. Senators like Chafee and Stafford and David Dernberger is another one from Minnesota, who take that line, but that's not something you see today. but it's remarkable how dramatically the politics can change in such a short amount of time, and it does start to shift very suddenly in 1989 when the oil and gas industry starts to get very involved in the politics of it.
Well, politics do shift, and they can shift to and fro. And I think you make it clear, and anybody who reads the newspapers, I know that's a quaint reference, watches podcasts, but clearly we have lost a number of years where we could have done things, and it doesn't seem to be a ripe moment in Congress or the White House or even most state houses. But even in the last few weeks, the American Petroleum Institute shifted its position, as did the Texas Oil and Gas Agency, to say that we really have to do something about climate and reduce emissions. Now, this was a huge policy reversal. And I think it was 3 days ago that BlackRock Inc., one of the largest investment funds on the planet, announced that they are going to start making climate management and emissions reduction a big grading point in how they make their investment decisions. If you want them to invest in your business or your line of business, show that you're serious about this. And keep in mind that when you buy shares in that way, you can vote. This was a very significant development, and it's not happening in the governmental world. And then even most significantly, Nathaniel, you're a New Yorker, and you chose to make New Orleans your home. Now, these are things that may give people hope.
You're reminding me of what happened.
Is there call for that?
You're reminding me of my sort of classic, New Orleans moment, which is after I bought so I moved here about 10 years ago. After I bought a house here, I went to to get my homestead exemption at City Hall, and you have to bring every proof of residence and, driver's license, utility bills, etc. And I brought them, and the clerk said, "Where are you from? Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I'm from New York, but as you can see from my 8 forms of proof, I'm now a resident of Louisiana." And she looked at me and was like, "You're in New York." I've made my peace with that. That's fine. My sons, however, are native New Orleanians and Pelicans fans. Sorry, where did that question begin? Oh yeah, well I think what's really shocking to me, for a little refresher for people who might not be up on some of this stuff, starting in 1989, just as the U.S. is right at the precipice of not only leading this international climate accord, but it's talking about these transformational pieces of legislation that, as I said, were well beyond even what the Green New Deal is, talking about bringing down emissions, some of them sanctions for countries that weren't living up to the accord, things like that. You have, in the research I discovered for the first time what exactly happened within the American Petroleum Institute and Exxon at the top of this hierarchy of the industry. And what happened is they held a couple of policy meetings in which they said, we need to come up with a political response to this. What should our stand be on this issue? Now, of course, the industry had been studying the science going back into the 1950s. Exxon had been studying this when it was still Humble Oil in 1957. And even then, the studies that we have, it wasn't, is global warming happening? It was how much is Exxon responsible for global warming? That's 1957, or Humble Oil. So they're fully up on the science, but now it's finally a public policy question. And so they have a couple of meetings, Exxon and API, and they both publish these white papers within a few months of each other. And they're basically make the same points, which are essentially we need to be active in the political conversation. We need to emphasize our credentials as scientists. They're very proud of their scientific operations. We need to make sure that we emphasize uncertainty in the science where it exists. That's sort of the beginning of the little turn. It's not to say we need to emphasize that global warming is uncertain. It's we need to emphasize the uncertainty in some of the projections. And we will refuse to support any laws that cut into our bottom line. So that's the beginning. That's 1989. That's the year you start seeing quotes in newspapers and national magazines from the same handful of scientists who I learned, some of whom were paid by API, who said, this thing is overblown, we're not so sure about the science. That's just the very beginning of sowing doubt. What I learned from the authors of these reports, who are fascinating people because they to this day see themselves as kind of environmental experts, and have moved on to kind of corporate consulting and environmental issues. But we were themselves surprised at how successful this PR strategy was. The PR aspect of it wasn't even the main part of it. They were trying to lobby politicians and so on, but the PR success of sowing doubt was so successful that it ultimately, by the mid-90s and 90s, took over their whole operations, and they realized it was enough. If they could cause enough people to doubt this, the politics wouldn't move. Of course, they spent a ton of money on lobbying as well. But then, and this is now outside of the main story of losing Earth, but another striking thing happens in the early 2000s, which is that the industry itself starts to become almost embarrassed by how successful this message is, and you have the first few companies starting to shy away from this kind of rhetoric, while meanwhile it takes root in the Republican Party, and you get to a point today where you have Exxon, if you see their national TV ads, in a football game, you'd think they're a green energy company. It's all about algae. And green is throughout the whole commercial. And meanwhile, you can't run for national office now, it seems, as a Republican if you talk about climate change as a real thing. So the party has moved beyond where the industry is. So this, to circle back to your points about what's these sort of reports this week, you've heard things from Shell, from API. I would take them with some skepticism, and but I think it at least shows that the public, it's shameful publicly, or at least in terms of some shareholder purposes, to pretend this isn't going on. They can't get away with that anymore.
Well, again, I hang around lawyers, and there's one additional take that I might offer, because changes like that don't come from nowhere. Obviously, there are a couple of factors that are happening in the broader world that are affecting all lines of business, but certainly, the energy sector. And one is insurance companies and bond raters are starting to take note of climate change and the risks, and whether you're doing anything to mitigate it. And if you don't acknowledge that risks exist, then it's hard to convince people to share that with you. Second is, it's federal law, at least for publicly traded, businesses, that you have to disclose, certain financial information, things that are important to, and analyzing whether you're being fair with people here in the financial markets and the like. And so that's what the Securities and Exchange Commission really, does every day. And they're required, all companies subject to that, to disclose what kind of risks that they see coming. And climate is one of those. So if you going back to, measuring up the rhetoric, that you hear in one place with what's being said in another, if you read a 10K, which is an annual filing that companies make with the Securities and Exchange Commission, they've been acknowledging, the honesty of climate change and even their own potential vulnerability. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're seeing some of this, that in order to ensure access to capital, you have to be more than a public relations firm.
Right.
And also the state of New York sued Exxon for the very things you're talking about.
Right.
Now, I don't know if they're going to win. I doubt that they do. But the point was, they said, you knew all these things, but you told people not to worry. You told people it wasn't an issue, yet you knew all along it was. That starts to sound like you're lying to people in order to get them to invest in you. That's the kind of thing that if you're in a boardroom, and I used to do a fair amount of corporate counsel work. You say, this is serious. This isn't an environmental lawsuit against you. This is something that goes to your business model.
Securities fraud.
So there are factors at play far beyond, the normal, let's have a march, let's see what Greta Thunberg says, all these things, which are all hugely important. But there are multiple factors coming to the table right now, in part because the pace of change is speeding up. It wasn't so many years ago that the head of the Bank of England, called Mark Carney, was at Lloyd's of London, which is the big international insurance exchange, and he was pleading with them to think about climate change, because he was describing it as the crisis, the tragedy of the horizon, which is we're all making business decisions on a 3 to 5 to 10-year basis, but the climate and the planet are changing so fast that if we wait until our options present within a 5-year window, it would be too late to act. So you may have heard the tragedy of the commons. This is the one I think we'll hear more about. And that's kind of what I really think Rafe was, and what you're really pointing out is that the horizon was visible in the 70s. And most of us, for what personal, institutional reasons, political reasons, were unable or unwilling to see it. And and that is a sad thing. But again, every time a window closes, another window opens for someone. So where do you see us going from here?
Well, I think we would be also remiss, and this kind of mentioned that just a few hours ago, a judgment came down in this Juliana case, which was 21 children at the time of filing sued the U.S. government, including James Hansen's own granddaughter, and Hansen has been heavily involved in the case, sued the government for not taking action and in fact even making the problem worse, despite knowing of full well the dangers going back to the Johnson administration. I was researching, I was doing listening at the same time as the lawyers were doing the research for that case, and I interviewed them, and there was a period in which I thought their case might be the end of the book. But yeah, their sources were my sources, so but yeah, I think it's, but they lost today on an appeal, and we'll see what happens next. But essentially it was a striking decision, because it was a 3-panel judge. There was one objection, but the 2 who ruled against it basically said, you're right on the merits of the case. The government knew this, they failed to act, they've made your life worse, they're making your future unbearable, and yet we don't believe that the courts have the ability to force the government to act. We don't believe that we can impose the remedy, that the remedy has to be voters. So we'll see what happens there, but they were making a kind of moral case, and I think that, you mentioned before living in New Orleans, and I think that's in some ways what got me started on some of these questions, because people have asked me, certainly since the book was published, how can you justify living in a city that's so threatened by climate change when you know all of this? And of course, I can list some rationalizations, but at the end of the day, I think we all have certain rationalizations that we tell ourselves when it comes to climate change. And if anything, New Orleans, which I think is so commonly thought of, by the general public as a sort of city of the past, haunted by the past and all of that, is in this regard a city of the future, because you can't, be a thinking person, I think, in the city now, living here today, and not have to come face to face with some of these anxieties, and how does one negotiate that? How do we think about it? How do we deny it? Do we become obsessed with it? And I've certainly run the gamut in my own personal life. But I think that's something where literature and really the arts more generally has a role to play. I think it's through particular narrative, I think it's an opening into some of these questions that really each of us has to resolve for him or herself. And so that's really how I got started on this whole thing to begin with.
That's fascinating. And first of all, I'd like to thank NOMA for hosting us this evening. These are conversations that need to happen. But it's also in the context, you go out and you see, the Acadiana landscape exhibit. And if you don't know what your landscape used to look like, it's hard to imagine how it's changing. The plants, the animals, the topography, the hydrology are all fundamentally different. But if if you don't know what you've lost, you can't really put a price on it, or you can't even talk about what restoration might mean. And so I think it's absolutely terrific. And Tina Freeman's photographic exhibit is fundamentally tied to the need to show how systems are linked, systems are changing, yet there's still beauty.
Yeah, I was really struck by this. The Acadiana show was fascinating. Most fascinating to me was not only that it's this long lost Louisiana, but that the painters at the time were themselves nostalgizing the place, so that a lot of these paintings, even going back into the early mid-19th century, are themselves fantasies of a lost past. And so it makes you think, how much of this is built into ourselves. And of course, they're not just, fantasies of how beautiful the bayous were before industry started and logging started coming on. There's also these pure, black people are literally erased, and slaves literally erased from the canvases. So those kinds of contradictions, I think, are really have been underexplored. But I think living in southern Louisiana, certainly, it's in your face every day.
Well, and you made one other observation that I think is worth commenting on. Then we'll look in Florida, include our guests in the conversation. That New Orleans, for all of its perceived charm and its resistance to change, which I think is, way overblown. But it is in many ways, not only a city of the future, but one of the major cities of the future. New Orleans is dealing with the scale of change that other places are just about to. And needless to say, we're not doing a great job, but we have options. And quite frankly, if you've traveled, especially the coastal areas around the country, there are places that envy the chances that New Orleans has. And if you go to Norfolk, Virginia, which is a coastal sinking city, seas are rising, and they don't have levees. And they have salt water that's moving into their groundwater, which is where they get their drinking water frequently, in addition to piping it in from the mountains. They wonder, how on earth can we have as much of a shot as New Orleans? They don't have a river that builds land. They're perched on the edge, we're not. They don't have levees, they don't have pumps, and they don't have, if you will, restoration plans or the same kind of urban water plan. New Orleans, and quite frankly Louisiana, has earned a shot. If it were not for the efforts, citizen-led efforts, to make coastal restoration and urban water management a thing, there would have, in my view, been no revenue sharing from offshore. There would have been no BP settlement that benefited, coastal Louisiana and its communities. Those were investments in the promise of those plans.
And I also think there are also difficult political and really moral questions that are now being asked here that haven't yet been asked anywhere else. We were talking about it a little earlier, but for me, the best example of this is, the Coastal Master Plan, right? And these diversions. For those who aren't familiar with it, the idea is it's essentially, as far as I understand it, the most ambitious global warming mitigation plan in the world right now, right? Engineering project in the world, or even geoengineering project in the world, is to rebuild the Louisiana coast. And the main way of doing that is to flood the Mississippi through these diversions, and the sediment from these new, basically man-made rivers washing into the marsh over time turns into land. It's the short version of it. And yet, the people who live in those places where the diversions are intended to be built are the ones who are most avidly against them. And from the distance of New Orleans, or Washington, D.C., you might say, well, how could that be? Don't they understand that if the no diversions are built, they're doomed in 10 or 20 years? And of course, the answer is that they're fishermen, and the diversions bring fresh water, or river water, I think, prefer the nomenclature, because it's filthy, and really has a deleterious effect on fishing habitats, and so there are major short-term consequences. And it's very easy to talk about how a small group of people should sacrifice for the much greater group of people, but try going, down to Venice and telling a fisherman that, and there's actually a moral claim that's being made that I think has to be heard. And those kinds of, questions of where maybe the right thing to do from a climate perspective can cause innocent people to suffer. That's a tricky subject, and that's one that, at least in this country, we haven't even begun to debate how to deal with that. But here in Southern Louisiana, we're